I really appreciate being here with you and having this opportunity to talk a bit based on my experience on the Transboundary Haze Pollution challenge that ASEAN has really been working with for several decades now. My topic is on the politics of haze, and in and of itself, a very complex issue, but in particular with respect to the ASEAN organization. So I'll try to look in this presentation to really do a bit of a deep dive on the regime, the institutions, and the culture. Specifically also the culture, because I think that sort of permeates how ASEAN does business and how it has been addressing transboundary haze. So to be a little more, I guess, creative, and this may be an experiment in futility, but we'll see. I'm trying to, basically my first part will be talking about regionalism and how that has evolved and how it has changed transboundary haze. And then the second part, I'll try to reverse that and see how, and I'm already, I guess, telegraphing my opinion on that is how transboundary haze has changed regionalism. And it has, as I'll be explaining a little later, it has certainly made its mark on regionalism. But the other aspect of haze that it has also nudged at and moved the bar, you might say, on this concept of ASEAN centrality, which is essentially, anything regional, anything in our region that has to do with all of us, all 10 of us in this case. Hopefully in some point there'll be 11 of us. This is a shout out to my Timor-Leste friends and colleagues. That would also change this concept and notion of centrality. And centrality is really deeply ingrained in ASEAN's diplomacy and its central tenets as an organization. We'll see why a little later. And then, of course, how the changing concept of centrality has changed transboundary haze itself. Then we'll go to a discussion on whether haze, the politics of haze, not just politics itself, but the political economy, social aspects of haze have been transformative to the organization, or really a source of dysfunctionalism. And I put it to you, we'll have hopefully a discussion after that. To really understand ASEAN, to really get grounded in ASEAN, I've been told that many of you, and looking at the polls, that some of you have really not been as exposed. And maybe this is a kind of a quick ASEAN 101. To understand ASEAN, it really has moved, and it's not a passive organization by all means. It has changed. It changed in good ways. But it was also changed in ways which are questionable. So as you know, it started in 1967 with the Bangkok Declaration. We had here the peak of the Vietnam War. You had basically the region and acting as the proxy of the global forces at that time. And important leaders basically stood up and tried to assert itself and stand aside. And you might remember, you're as old as me, that there was a Southeast Asia Treaty Organization that really tried to develop the political security context of it. That was quickly dissolved, and this whole notion of an ASEAN association drew support back in '67 with the initial 4 or 5 member states. So that's a very important landmark for ASEAN. Fast forward by a decade or so, you have then the ASEAN Concord 1. And here is the beginnings of trying to describe and basically stake out an identity for the region. And ASEAN Concord really is an attempt to say, well, to outline the parameters of what was later known as open regionalism. So here you have development cooperation initiatives, which are based on the Treaty of Amity and Cooperation, which is the founding treaty of the organization. Basically, it sets out the terms of exchanges, of cooperation. And also, it helped to outline what it needs and wants through its external relations. Now, several decades later, you have the organization really think hard about what it really wants to be. An ASEAN that is integrated, but in doing what, to what purpose? So the ASEAN Concord tries to essentially map these things out. They already identify 3 pillars, and you'll know in ASEAN is when they talk about 3 pillars, it's really about the political security, the economic, and the social cultural pillars. And these have now action plans. They are linked to the Millennium Declaration, the Millennium Development Goals, and underpinning that is the ASEAN Vision of 2020, and an action plan that helps to also solidify that. And because the new members of Cambodia, Laos, Myanmar, and Vietnam have come in, there was also what they call the Initiative for ASEAN Integration, which was specifically for helping the other new member states who are very diverse in terms of not just income, but in terms of ideology, philosophy, state philosophy, and so on, to come to a common ground through this initiative. And of course, you already had ASEAN establish itself as a regional platform through the ASEAN Regional Forum and this Southeast Asia nuclear weapons free zone. So fast forward again another decade, you have then ASEAN redefining itself as a regional mechanism that is going to contribute to a global public good. So you have now several years before that, you have the ASEAN Charter, a new foundation that is beginning. Development cooperation starts beginning to assist the ASEAN countries through what is called the Community Roadmap. That was from 2009 to 2015. And fast forward today, you have now in 2015, of course, you had the announcement of an ASEAN community. So ASEAN now is a community. That's the formal terminology, if we want to call it that. But now it has a bigger vision. We won't go into the vision now, but you could. What's important is that it does evolve through a much more standardized institutional framework, processes, and a lot of the activities are aligned through these community blueprints. These 3 communities, the political security and economic, as well as the social cultural community, were much more performance, I guess, oriented, results oriented. So in the first 2 decades, really, ASEAN has been doing sort of regionalism light, right? 1.0. And there it took its cue from many regional thinkers and to develop an organization that really followed what was called then functionalism, which was really a forerunner of globalization theory and strategies. And the thinking really focused on, yes, a cooperative arrangement to deal with day-to-day interstate affairs, but also to open up avenues of supporting each other in health, education, and some transboundary concerns. And among those early transboundary concerns was pollution. So this is important to know. And it's also notable that during those years, what is now called socio-cultural community was then called functional cooperation. So you do have a very strong link with political science theory, international relations theory that is very evident. And it's not surprising because we do have the regional diplomats really charted the course and laid the foundation for ASEAN. Again, fast forward some further decades, you have what is called neo-fascism. You have what is called national functionalism, and that really takes the cue from the European experience, the European economic cooperation, the common market there. And for a long time, ASEAN's thinkers were seen as modeling that European experience, this neo-functionalism experience. But the biggest change, I think, in ASEAN's thinking in terms of how the organization should involve was really the Brundtland report, and that's the report by the former Prime Minister of Norway, Brundtland, who also chaired this World Commission on Environment and Development. It was back in 1987. It had a very long-lasting impression on the body politic, the political discourse going on in ASEAN about what is this organization, what should what are we all about? And there, as you may recall, the Brundtland report really looked at economic growth. They essentially identified sustainable development. So the language of sustainable development began to be absorbed by the region, the ASEAN community, and I'm talking about here really the intergovernmental community, and even the concept of sustainable communities. So Brundtland talked about sustainable communities, and this was a very attractive idea. The idea that it's not just one community, but many. And so it had to be founded on multilateralism, interdependence, not just sustainable development. But all that supports economic growth, economic protection, and social equality. So you do have a much more expansive understanding of international norms that gain currency among ASEAN thinkers. So at the same time, this growing body of people, as I call them, the functional cooperationists, maybe you can call them, they began to shape regionalism in a different way, in the Brundtland way, if you want to call it that. They looked at social, cultural, so everything that's not political, everything that's not economic would be under them. That's the idea of functionalism. And that it would be looking at development or sectoral cooperation. This old-fashioned idea of technical cooperation among developing countries, TCDC. That became passé, as you know, and has really been overtaken by this concept of South-South cooperation. So that has been very much within the ethos and the driving force of the social cultural community, the growing or the nascent social cultural community. But even within those 2 decades, there was a feeling of being the third child, a feeling of not being the most well-regarded pillar, because much of the lead was taken by the political security and economic cooperation. So you see that very much in the collective mood of those who are driving the ASEAN social cultural community. But certainly it's rooted in functionalism, neo-functionalism, as you call it. That's the whole idea of integration, of an economic integration, and influenced by globalization. As you know, globalization really gained currency in the last 2 or 3 decades because of the concept of global value chains, of interdependence, interconnectivity, the digital, and all the changes that were the so-called disruptive technologies that globalization introduced. Now, why am I emphasizing this so much? Because in the end, because of, I guess, the institutionalization of regionalism in ASEAN, the ASEAN social cultural community evolved, and it controls, in effect, how it interfaces with the other pillars. It acts in a sense of gatekeeper, and so this is an important cultural element or dimension in understanding ASEAN. Because we have 3 pillars, rightly or wrongly. This is how the founders charted the course, and now one pillar is where all that action is. Transboundary Haze happened to be under the social cultural community. Now, while social culturalism or the social cultural community was expanding from initial of 3 or so sectors: health, education, labor. And it started expanding to something over 20 sectors now. But while it was doing this consolidation of all its efforts and this blueprint, of course, the real geopolitical landscape was driven by economic regionalism, and this is what I think part of where Surin's presentation also focused on, where the tendency is now to look at a much more integrated ASEAN, but in a very economic point of view. Why was that? Well, one was the fear of Fortress Europe. Europe was becoming a block in itself, a marketplace, where you had to do business through this one window, Europe. And there were obviously conditions where you had to fulfill to partner with Europe. But also in that time period of the early 90s, late 80s, you had the North American Free Trade Agreement. And the member states started getting very, very concerned that they will be missing out. They'd have to also promote themselves as a better union. And Thailand stepped up and said, well, let's not go into necessarily professional trade agreements. Let's go into a much wider, comprehensive, all-encompassing AFTA. That's the ASEAN Free Trade Agreement. This is important to understand because it's actually based on this broader economic regionalism that you had ASEAN multinational companies, the Charung Pokpans of the world, the Asia Pulp and Papers, and many of the Asian-based multinational corporations, transnational corporations, began to assert themselves and be part of the body politic, and you'll see much more in that later on. So there's also a fear of China. China's not something new. Back in the late 90s, the ASEAN were very fearful that ASEAN was basically sucking up the foreign investments. And so Singapore, as always the case in these issues, certainly stood up and said, look, we have to begin developing this concept, notion of the economic community. So this early beginnings of economic regionalism can be really traced to Singapore's own concerns. Of course, it led in terms of export economy, but also how it saw the world around it. And it's also important to point out that the G5 at that time, so they had a Plaza Accord, which essentially U.S. was complaining about the trade imbalances, the trade deficits. Isn't that an interesting thing? Because it has haunted us for a while now, but in a new iteration. You had basically the U.S. complaining about the German and the value of the Japanese yen, the German Deutschmark, and the Japanese yen, and they wanted a new accord that would allow that. Well, that immediately changed the flow of FDIs. So these are very important issues to remember, because once you start opening up FDI, you also have an add-on effect, a piggyback and a tandem effect that the regional-based companies were able to exploit very well, because then you had these large conglomerates, these large syndicates and consortiums. They became the early beginnings of a state, private sector or transnational sector, transnational corporations was already beginning to set. And internally, Indonesia. It's again Indonesia, but not about transboundary haze. Indonesia was because oil price fell in the late 80s, and it started to shift to export orientation. Now, Thailand, Philippines, Singapore, Malaysia had already started that, but Indonesia was always the latecomer, and it began to shift. That changed also the whole outlook of ASEAN to become much more this economic community. You can also thank Kunanan Panjarachun in the early 90s, who basically nudged ASEAN to agree to AFTA. It's not unusual or not surprising that Indonesia was basically pushed, kicking and screaming to agree to the AFTA terms. And of course, once again, Indonesia was critical to upheavals politically, because in the 1998, 1997, we didn't only have Transboundary Haze, we also had the financial crisis. And Indonesia, of all the ASEAN countries, was hit the worst. And Malaysia, under Prime Minister Muhammad Mahathir, really wanted to espouse this, or to bring this ASEAN Vision 2020 out. A very, I think, enlightened vision, and we have to credit Malaysia for pushing that. The idea then here is that the point I was making, basically, ASEAN's open regionalism really went through a lot of changes. It has benefited from the kind of political influence that it has in this so-called distributed leadership. At one time, Suharto would be calling the shots, another Mahathir, and then Ramos, and so on. So they did really set in stage the foundation of this open regionalism. And although a lot of people talk about the ASEAN way, it's really now we talk more about the ASEAN centrality, where anything regional really has to be through a consensus approach, and through the 10 agreeing on what the direction of the region is. You begin to see also the beginnings of institutional culture. I think Helena's landmark work on the politics of haze and regionalism, environmental regionalism, I think is splendid in that, and I think it really bears further review and reading. Yeah, so, okay, in terms of how transboundary haze changed regionalism, so we talked a bit about how regionalism began to change transboundary haze, but transboundary haze had a very important role in changing it too. But back in 1990, you already had the Kuala Lumpur Accord on Environment and Development, 1990, and that really had a very important role, important component on transboundary pollution. You also had the Singapore Summit that identified transboundary pollution as a primary environmental concern. Okay, we're not talking about just a concern; it's a primary concern. So, so you could see the increasing escalation of transboundary pollution as a concern, and you then had the first ASEAN Cooperation Plan in 1994. And a year after that, the formation of the Haze Technical Task Force. So you could see a progression in the way that the organization had considered haze. Already in the early 80s, you had some major outbreaks, but not so much major, because, as you know, few years later, 97 and 98, you had these major outbreaks. Won't get into that, but because it was really slightly briefly covered by Sue Lin. 9 million hectares were basically taken out of existence, and largely in those countries that you see listed. It was estimated the loss would be 6 billion, but there's been many studies since that revisited it, looked at the methodologies, etc. And you can find, even science, as we're saying, could sometimes be very, I should say, not absolute. So even the economic loss estimates of those days have been challenged. But against that was the Asian financial crisis, as you know, and that cause a lot of pain, not in terms of how ASEAN sees itself, but how ASEAN addresses the issue of transboundary haze. So you then have this very quickly in succession after these different cooperation agreements, frameworks were done, all these different plans. So you had the Regional Haze Action Plan, which was my own personal experience of in the negotiations, in the regional negotiation before, please. Yeah. And you'll see after that, of course, 3 years after that was the ASEAN Peatland Management Initiative. Why did that happen? Because the Regional Haze Action Plan really covered more responses. It looked at emergency responses. There was prevention, but there was more mitigating and monitoring. And it didn't have a legal framework behind it. It didn't have the legal muscle. That only came in November 2003 with the ASEAN Agreement on Transboundary Haze Pollution, which is still considered the only environmental agreement that the region really has. And that covers monitoring, assessment and prevention, technical cooperation, scientific research, mechanisms for coordination, lines of communication, simplified customs and immigration procedures for disaster relief. So moving of supplies and materials to help combat haze. 2 years after that, again, the results of the ASEAN Peatland Management Initiative came about and resulted in the ASEAN Peatland Management Strategy, which provided this common framework specifically for peat, right? And in September 2013, you notice almost close to a decade has gone until another program comes up that really looked at stakeholders. So stakeholders, including government, private sector committees, and civil society to achieve the goal of the APMS. And finally, you have in August 2016, this roadmap on ASEAN cooperation towards transboundary haze pollution control with means of implementation. That is, in shorthand, it's called the ASEAN Haze-Free Roadmap. That provides much more strategic or action-oriented, time-bound frameworks, etc. If you look at this this chronology, you could see a lot of concerns. Of course, in '97, concurrent with the fires, you had this action plan. So there was an attempt to respond, and there was some mobilization of efforts, but there was not a scientific basis to look at it, and it was really left up to the APMI to help and focus on the issue of peatlands. Without a legal foundation, it was difficult to enforce, to monitor, to draw sanctions, and that was that is why the ASEAN Agreement on Transboundary Haze Pollution, or the AATHP, was required. You see a progression on that, but you also see a reactive approach where oh, we forgot about haze. Yeah, you know, we should have a common strategy about managing the peat. And then, yeah, you know, we work with these stakeholders, and yet we did not provide the kind of supporting framework they would have. And then, oddly enough, you have this roadmap that says, yeah, this should be the broader thing. I mean, so from '97 to 2016, you had this ASEAN drawing up a structure almost piece by piecemeal, and with a lot of gaps in some cases. And so you have this agreement. The agreement, of course, contains these measures which I already described, but it also, on the right column there, it also foresaw the establishment of this ASEAN Coordinating Center. This is very vital. It really is the linchpin for the management and control of the operations. For a while, you had these standard operating procedures that were developed, and the linkage with ACC and the national monitoring centers that were eventually established, much later, by the way. They were national action plans, but they lacked an institutional support mechanism, and these national monitoring centers were evolved much later. We talked a bit about the ASMC, but time actually is constraining me. I will just simply say that the ASMC was a facility that actually predated and ran concurrent to the transboundary haze. It didn't look at haze specifically. It provided meteorological information for a bunch of things, such as civil and military navigation, but also in terms of agro-meteorology, planning for agriculture and forestry. So it performed a number of functions before it was called upon to focus also on the haze. And also at that time, you already had huge technological development and progress in, remote satellite imagery and so on. And so it's the premier facility in ASEAN for this. There are also issues there. We can talk about that later.